What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today, we're going to be having probably the most important video on this channel for the entire summer, and that's going to be the early round draft strategy. What we're going to go over today is how your strategy needs to be in the first 4 to 5 rounds, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on the first 4 rounds. Tomorrow will be about reaching, and I'll talk about reaching today, but this video kind of goes hand in hand with tomorrow because it can be a part 1 and part 2. Tomorrow will be reaching overall, but it'll focus on the middle and the late rounds, whereas today is just going to focus on the early rounds. So I will cover reaching in this video, but check tomorrow for the overall thought process on reaching for the entire draft. By the end of this video, I want you to fully understand the players and really the positions you need to be targeting early and the things you can and cannot do. So, the first aspect of this is probably the thing that the most people know, but also that the most people screw up. And that's thinking about what position you're going to draft before the draft even happens. I know that the first 5 or 6 picks are pretty straightforward. There's really no reaching. You kind of know who's going to go. But at the end of the first round, people start to panic a little bit because a lot of the players are similar and a lot of different things can happen. So what do I mean by this? Let's say you're the 9 pick. Okay, I'm going to pull up Fantasy Football Calculator, their ADPs for a 12-team PPR league. A lot of people, when they get towards the end of the first round, say maybe I want to go 2 wide receivers or I want to go wide receiver running back. You cannot do that because these picks are going to differ from draft to draft. You can say most of the time I'd like to go double wide receiver if the value presents itself. Or I'd like to go wide receiver and then running back if the value presents itself. But do not lock yourself into a box. Let's just say Odell gets taken at 8. Hopkins gets taken at 7 and Barkley's taken at 6. And we now have Kamara at 9. But in the back of your mind, you remember, running backs are riskier and I don't want to risk my first round pick. So I'm going to reach on wide receiver. And now we do have a drop-off, Brown, Hopkins, Odell, then a drop-off to Michael Thomas and Keenan Allen. Maybe you have a different preference. It doesn't matter for this exercise. But there is that range of Julio, Michael Thomas, and Keenan Allen. That's the next bunch. So you say, okay, I'm pretty sure Michael Thomas won't bust, and I think he's a great player. So I'm going to take him at 9. And I've heard that Kamara has imminent regression. I want to avoid him. You can't put yourself into that mindset just because you think a position is riskier in the first round. Because what you've just done is added risk to Michael Thomas. Now, what does that mean? He's going to perform the same no matter where you draft him. Yes and no. A first-round pick needs to produce more than a second-round pick does. That's just how it works. If I had 5 first-round picks, sure, they wouldn't really need to produce that much because I just got all the talent in the draft. But as soon as you start reaching ahead in rounds, they're no longer values. They need to perform like the round you're drafting them in. So if you draft Michael Thomas at 9, he needs to return 9th overall value. He no longer has to return 15th overall value. And there is a big difference. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what you've done is you've reached on Michael Thomas. So now you come on to your next pick. And if you start at 9, your next pick's around 16. So it's entirely likely that all of those running backs are gone. Hunt's gone, Gordon's gone, Fournette's gone, and Cook's gone. So you're looking at the range of McCaffrey, Freeman, McCoy, Mixon. Mixon, but McKinnon. So it really doesn't depend, again, for this exercise, but let's say you go with McCaffrey. You go for the best overall. So your first 2 picks are Michael Thomas and McCaffrey. They're fine, but they're ranked 15th and 18th in ADP. That's not fine. You just sacrificed your first round pick just so that your position you drafted is a wide receiver, and that makes no sense. Instead, in this exercise, let's just take Alvin Kamara. We'll take Alvin Kamara. I much prefer Barkley, but Barkley was drafted in this scenario, and now Kamara is a value at 9. We take Kamara, and then it's entirely likely that in this range of Julio, Michael Thomas, Keenan Allen, Devonta Adams, we get to pick 2. Well, obviously not 2. We get to pick one of those 2. And we're guaranteed to pick one of them because we're 16th and, Devonta Adams is at 17. So we get one of them. So it's entirely likely that instead of picking Michael Thomas and McCaffrey. We've just picked Alvin Kamara and Keenan Allen just because we decided we're not going to let all these positions that we need to take at certain spots influence our draft position or our draft, where we're drafting positions. In the first round, you need to just take whichever player you have ranked higher. And I know that's tough for some people to say, I really want to take a wide receiver, and then wide receivers get taken. You just have to take the value because you cannot be going into different rounds because those players will need to provide much more value than being projected to provide. The next part we need to talk about is when there's a tie. So when we look at it and we have two players ranked really closely, which position do we favor? Sometimes it's not the position. Sometimes you might have people ranked closely, but they're in different tiers, and that's why you need tier-based rankings like we have on the website. But if you don't have tier-based rankings, or they're in the same tier, or they're just so close you can't decide, we suggest that people lean running back early. And it is usually harder to hit, but when you hit, it's more important. And you have anywhere from about a 10 to a 15% less chance of hitting. So yes, it is more difficult to predict running back success than wide receiver. That is a fact. But we're not trying to get fourth place. And I tell people that a lot, and they kind of shrug and they say, I don't care. No, we're not trying to get fourth place. We're trying to win. So you need to take some sort of risk. And I know I say avoid risk in the first 4 rounds, but just drafting a running back isn't adding too much risk. Reaching is adding risk. But just drafting a running back isn't. And then people say, well, I just want to go maybe RB0. I want to pick all the wide receivers because that's my best chance of just getting starting positions. No, it is not. And a huge misconception is that it's pretty easy to hit on your first couple round picks. It is not. Your odds of hitting on your first 5 picks is a maximum of about 14%. You have about a 14% chance, best case scenario, of hitting on all 5 of your first round picks. And now, all 5 of your first picks. Now, what do I mean by hitting? This is going to terrify some of you. Hitting in this scenario is a top 31 option. So if you draft a running back in the second round, there's a 76% chance he'll finish inside the top 31. Think about that for a second. In the first round, it's about 74%. There actually is an increase in the hit rate of the second round, but the first round produces higher results because we're only looking at top 31 options here. Look at the difference between the first portion of this draft and the end. Hitting on a 10th, 11th, 12th round pick, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of getting a top 31 option. That's 31 for their position. So top 31 running back or a top 31 wide receiver. But you need to accept the fact that one of your first 5 picks is going to bust. And if you extend that to the 6th round, it drops to about 7 or 8%. Best case scenario. Now I've listed out the different combinations here. RB0 happens to be about the 5th best at like a little under 13%. The best hit rate has been running back, then 3 wide receivers, and then running back. But what I also want to mention is you don't see quarterback on this list. And there's a reason for that. Look at these numbers. Look at the top 4 rounds. And now look at the 7th round. For you to take, let's say, Travis Kelce in the 3rd round, and then Aaron Rodgers in the 4th. Let's say he slips to the 4th round. You take Kelce in the 3rd, Aaron Rodgers in the 4th. Now look at your odds of hitting at running back and wide receiver. They just got crushed. And given that you have pretty good odds in the 13th, 14th, 15th rounds of hitting on a quarterback, why would you not swap those two? So that's why you need to be targeting running backs and wide receivers in these first 4 rounds. That is just 100% of your leagues. That's what you need to do. I don't care how much Aaron Rodgers slips into the 4th. I don't care how good you think he is. I don't care if you really want to target Travis Kelce in this new offense. I don't care. You need to draft running backs and wide receivers in your first 4 rounds. And another thing I wanted to mention here is look at the first round. Don't be afraid to take a running back. There's a huge misconception because everyone loves to throw up the charts about running backs getting injured more. And it's true. Running backs get injured more. But that does not mean that you have a worse off chance of hitting on a running back in the first round. You have a better chance. You have a better chance of hitting on a start-worthy, because that's what I define top 31 as, is start-worthy. Someone who's going to be a little worse than an RB2 maybe, but it's halfway. So I'm assuming that you start in 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and then half of the people start a running back in the flex and half start a wide receiver. That's where you get 31. So a start-worthy option. You have a 74% chance at running back and a 70% chance at wide receiver. So do not let that misconception guide you into what position you're drafting. 2015 is still fresh in people's minds when every single running back tanked, and that's included in this model. So including 2015, you still have a better chance of hitting at running back. So now maybe you're saying, well, okay, running backs are super important. So I need to just take shots. I should just take running backs with every pick. No, that's also not what I'm saying. Wide receivers are important because to post a top 10 wide receiver season, you really can't find that in the 10th, 11th, 12th rounds. You can find running backs that late. Every year, there are running backs who just destroy. Think of Alvin Kamara. Kareem Hunt for the beginning portion of drafts was going pretty late, but towards the end, I was targeting him in the second round. A lot of people were targeting him in the first round. But think of your Kamaras. Think of your guys you find on free agency. You don't really see that with wide receiver. So I'll talk about that again in tomorrow's video. But what I don't want you to say is that running back is super important, so I can only target running backs early. You did not see a wide receiver 0 section on this chart. You did not see just running backs for even the first 3 rounds on this chart because you have a very low chance of hitting on all those running backs. And then if you take all those shots and you miss on some of the running backs, you're really hurting your team's upside with wide receivers. But that also couples with the fact that I just said quarterbacks. You can't target quarterbacks early because then you're foregoing one of running back or wide receiver where they're hard to hit on and they're so much more important to hit on. What I recommend is that every draft you go into, you need to highlight players that you're targeting. These aren't players you're reaching on, they're players you're targeting. They're players that you're comfortable with. Because that's the biggest thing about fantasy football is finding those players that you are comfortable drafting. You know their risk, you know their upside, and you're okay with it. You like their ADP, you like the value they provide, and you like how your team comes out when you take them. Because remember, you should be doing mock drafts over and over again, especially if you know your draft position. But you should have a set of players that you don't just like the player, you like how your team comes out when you draft that player. And that's what we've done with our premium rankings. We've gone through and highlighted all of the players that you should be targeting at different points in the draft under different scoring settings. Because remember, you should be targeting running backs more heavily early on for standard, and you should be targeting wide receivers slightly more as you move up in PPR. So from standard to half point to full point, that's how you shift the wide receiver value. I would still lean running back under any format, but it shifts more value towards wide receivers as you move towards full point PPR. Part of why we favor running backs is just the change in offenses, in how the back half of this wide receiver position is scoring more and more points every year. They're becoming more and more relevant, so it's easier to find lower end wide receivers that can get you by on free agency or later in drafts, but it is more difficult to hit on the higher end options. But why we say lean running back is because of how the game has changed, how important the high end running backs are, and the lesser importance of the higher end wide receivers. And I've written an article on that. I'll be posting another video on that, but just try and get your mind around the fact of scarcity and how if there are more high-end and more mid-round wide receivers, more mid-range wide receivers, the value of each one is lessened. Whereas if the game is shifting towards passing and there are less running backs that are 3-down backs. We're seeing a lot more guys do only first and second down and then the scat backs. So guys that can handle or have the potential to handle all 3 downs have so much more value because they're more scarce. And that ties in again to quarterback. There are so many quarterbacks that can post great years that the value of the elite ones is so much less. That's the idea of scarcity. And again, I've talked about it in other videos. I'll talk about it in future videos, and I've written an article on it. That's not what this video is about, but it's really what ties into every video, is that idea of scarcity. So what I want to do is just wrap basically everything that I've talked about up into one little summary. Your first 4 rounds are the most important in the draft because it's your best chance of hitting. Therefore, when you're in the 3rd and 4th rounds especially, do not under any circumstance reach into the 5th and 6th rounds. Your odds of hitting go down and the upside of those players goes down. If you're in the 1st round, don't lock yourself into a box thinking you have to draft a certain position. It is a misconception that running backs are riskier to draft in the 1st round. Everyone thinks about 2015. Everyone thinks about that one time, that one anecdote, that a running back they drafted busted and a wide receiver near that spot went off. Everyone thinks about the anecdote, but no one looks at the data. The data tells us that running backs are actually a little bit safer in the 1st round, not in rounds 2, not in rounds 3, not in rounds 4, and not for a large portion of the draft. There are only a handful, not even a handful. There are 1, 2, 3. There are 3 rounds where running backs are easier to predict, and one of them is the 1st. So don't lock yourself into a box. Don't go into the draft with a strategy. Don't go in with RB0 or wide receiver 0 for some reason. I don't know why you do that, but don't go into the draft with that kind of strategy. Use strategies if they present themselves. If everyone's drafting running backs, you know what? Maybe go wide receiver 0. I meant RB0. If everyone's drafting running backs, maybe take a bunch of wide receivers early. But don't go into the draft with that strategy. And don't take risk in these first 4 rounds. I've already told you that the positional risk isn't something you should be majorly concerned about. But don't go after these super high-risk players. Because if you bust on 3 of your first 4 picks, because remember, you're probably going to bust on at least 1, likely 2. Let's be honest. Likely 2 of your first 4 picks will bust. But if you bust on 3, and you only have your 2nd round pick, and then you're starting the 5th round, it's a huge drop-off in the chance that you're going to hit on a 5th round pick, you're really limiting your team's upside. You've really got to scrape through free agency to find players that can win you a championship. Because that's what we're trying to do here. Trying to win a championship. So lessen your risk. Don't reach. Don't lock yourself into a box. And don't be afraid to go running backs heavy in the first 4 rounds. All right. Stat of the day time. End this video off with the daily stat of the day. Tony Mann got yesterday's stat of the day. Which offensive line allowed the most pressures last season was the Houston Texans. I thought, personally, it was the Cardinals. Then my second guess was the Seahawks, but it was the Texans. Allowed the most pressures of any offensive line. Today's stat of the day, what team had 2 wide receivers finish in the top 5 in yards per reception? Which team, 2 wide receivers in the top 5 in yards per reception? There is no cap. They could have played any amount of snaps, had any amount of receptions. And I will give you a hint, these players did actually play. So you actually know who these guys are. So that's the end of this one. Hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, how about you hit that like button, subscribe if you are new. Thanks for watching.